Welcome to the program. I'm Jeff Schechtman. During our last great cultural and political upheaval in the 60s, music provided the soundtrack. Rock stars were not in Silicon Valley, but in the recording studios of Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Nashville. When Jerry Brown was governor of California the first time back in the late 70s, he talked about more wisdom being in the songs of the day than in all the advisors he had in Sacramento. Historically, our culture has been shaped by music, and music has shaped the culture. Additionally, music, like sports, in many ways has been a way out of poverty for so many. And few personify all of this better, particularly for many women, than Dolly Parton. And no one captures this ethos better than my guest, Sarah Smarsh, in her new book, She Come By It Natural. Sarah Smarsh is a journalist who has reported for the New York Times and The Guardian. Her previous book, Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth, was a finalist for the National Book Award. And it is my pleasure to welcome Sarah Smarsh back to this program to talk about She Come By It Natural, Dolly Parton and the woman who lived her songs. Sarah Smarsh, welcome back to the program.
Hi, Jeff. I'm so glad to be back with you.
Well, it's a delight to have you here. What is it about this time that has created this kind of Dolly Parton moment that we're seeing?
There is a moment, isn't there? And I believe that it has everything to do with our current political and social realities, which of course are quite fraught and fractious and divided. And Dolly Parton, while she has often been a quite progressive force in a cultural sense in the decisions she makes and the ideas that she embraces and the acceptance that she signals, she's nonetheless a somewhat apolitical figure, at least in her, overt approach to current events. And that has resulted in a very diverse fan base and a sort of universally beloved icon who is uniquely suited, I think, to provide some sense of unity or wholeness and a balm, really, at a moment when so many people are hurting and maybe even fearful of their neighbors.
And to what extent, and I know the two are inexorably linked, but talk about the difference between what she represents in terms of her music and how that's evolved over, 40 years, how that's evolved and her persona and what that represents.
Well, they certainly are intertwined, but you're right that they are sort of separate discussions. So to begin with the music, Dolly Parton, and this might surprise some listeners if they don't know her artistry well, considers herself a writer foremost, before a singer, before a performer, before a business mogul, which she certainly is that today. She's a writer first, and she's a quite prolific songwriter. She's famously published over 3,000 songs by her own pen over the decades. Many of those have been recorded by other artists, and that music, that storytelling is very much about home. It's about the place she comes from, and that place happens to be a poor holler in East Tennessee. And her rural, humble origins are sort of this touchstone that she returns to again and again in this, kind of eternal coming home, if you will, in the characters that she creates, the ideas that she conveys, and even the sensory experience of some of her early songwriting in particular is very much it's very earthy. It is of nature, but it's also telling stories about the plight of women in a man's world, and specifically poor rural women in a man's world. And her early songs were actually quite dark in their messages about society, even as they were, exalting and loving the concept of the place she comes from. Now, so there are a lot of layers to what's going on in her music. In more recent years, her songs tend to be they're kind of like these beacons of positivity, and they're bright and shiny. But if you go back through her canon, that's a really more modern phenomenon. Now, her persona is a quite different thing. And this is what even the lay Dolly Parton fan or listener would be more familiar with, is the big blonde wig and the very made up face and famously surgically altered body and big curves and tight clothes and sequins and really a physical caricature almost that is intentionally created by her, and she has spoken about this, to represent in some sense what some realms of our society would deem trashy, quote unquote. And this is her gesture, I think, also to the place that she comes from, to say, I made enough money to class myself up a long time ago, but I'm actually going to double down and and continue to kind of embody the tropes and stereotypes about the place I come from, so that when people encounter my genius, they will be forced to reconcile the truth of the depth of who I am as an artist with the ideas that they have about people, and specifically women, where I come from.
And to what extent did she understand that as ironic in a classic sense?
Well, I think we would. I think we wouldn't do well to underestimate her by thinking she didn't know what she was doing early on. There are actually some old interviews in the process of researching the book I came across where she actually makes that flat out statement. This is at a quite early point in her career, maybe like the early 70s, and interviewers would say things like, "Well, don't you think you look kind of silly or like a joke?" And she would say, I know exactly what I'm doing, and if anyone's laughing on me, the joke is actually on them, because I can change what I'm doing at any time. And of course, millions and millions of dollars later, I would think that we should agree that she was right. And how she came by that savvy, I think that the interesting thing about her, and the rare thing about her for her generation, was her very sophisticated understanding of specifically gender and to some extent class. But she was basically giving what we might call a self-aware gender performance long before the concept of gender as a social construct had entered the mainstream. And that might be one of the reasons, actually, she has an immense LGBTQ following, and she very much sees what she constructs in the kind of I don't know, symbols of stereotypical femininity that she's sort of pushing those buttons, whether it's the large breasts or the high heels and so on. She always understood that was a construct, and that even as society was telling women they had to do those things, she kind of subverted that power paradigm by, I don't know, turning herself into an object before the world had a chance to, if that makes sense. And she's actually made the comment, well, I just like shiny and glittery things, and if I'd been born a man, I would have been a drag queen. So, like, for her, it's there are so many layers to her understanding of gender and how it relates to people's assumptions and stereotypes. I think she was way ahead of society when she was doing that stuff, even in the 70s and 80s.
And way ahead of herself in so many respects, because there's a sense in what you write that this wasn't an understanding. It may have grown, but it didn't come out of her time in Nashville. She arrived in Nashville kind of knowing this fundamentally.
Yes, and I guess to what we attribute that, I couldn't speculate. I can say, and I write about this in the book, she was raised in a very strict patriarchal religious culture. Her grandfather was actually a pastor. And, very early on, at a very young age, she was precocious as a singer, musician, performer, yes, but she was also, hormonally precocious and intellectually precocious. And a lot of her, they couldn't afford makeup where she was and in her family, so she would take burnt matchsticks and to use them as eyeliner, or she would get feathers off the farm and put a hook through them, and she pierced her own ears. She's actually joked that she was like the original punk rocker. So the reason I point that out is because I think that for her, something innate in her was so expressive and wanted to be her own independent being in a culture that was, constantly at odds with that personal truth. Now, that experience is familiar to a lot of people. What Dolly Parton did with that experience, I think, was develop a very keen awareness of how she would be perceived moving through the world, where the limitations existed, where she could take those limitations and turn them into levers for her own gain. And she's a very savvy businesswoman, and amid all her creative genius. So I think that, like you say, she arrived in Nashville in 1964 already, to some extent, knowing exactly what kind of world she was stepping into, even as we might think she was some sort of naive bumpkin off the farm. She's a clever gal.
There was a sense that she took some kind, and she may not have been thinking about it this way, but there was a sense of risk that she took in the late 80s and early 90s in terms of her activity in Hollywood and the movies that she did. Talk about that.
Well, I'm sure that she was offered, just endless scripts, and there was this idea that she could and should move in the direction of acting in Hollywood. The first movie role that she accepted, I think, is so notable and so telling about what she represents as a creator and as a woman and as a professional, and that was, of course, 9 to 5. She co-starred with Lily Tomlin and Jane Fonda. And the reason in this movie that, of course, is this, a piece of feminist cinematic history that would be hard to top in terms of iconic films. And you used the term risk, and there were a lot of risks that were tied up in this film. For one thing, it was the brainchild and the creation of producer Jane Fonda, who was really at that moment still widely vilified in some more conservative factions of society for her anti-Vietnam War protests. She was on the right side of history, of course, and that sort of sentiment has since shifted in terms of her regard as a public figure. But at the time, you've got Dolly Parton in Nashville, and you've got, Jane Fonda out in California cooking up this like really bold film that involves the original script and involved the literal murder of the male boss. They ended up rewriting the script to be a little more palatable to audiences. The studio was afraid that the female characters, the female leads, wouldn't be likable enough unless they reconfigured that murder as a fantasy sequence of sorts. Anyway, Dolly Parton plays the, objectified and sexually harassed and, groped and demeaned secretary to that male boss. And she was in that role. Her kind of important piece of the puzzle is to represent the woman who is what we might term today slut shamed. So she is sort of this sexy figure in the office. The male boss is harassing her. Her female coworkers, to some extent, are there's animosity among them too, because they assume she's getting some sort of preferential treatment, and they assume that she is consensually conducting sexual relations with the boss. So there are a lot of layers there that previously hadn't really been discussed or examined or articulated in popular culture. And that, while we don't think of Dolly Parton as a political figure, all the same, the decisions that she has made, including that Hollywood premiere, which was, of course, a big hit, tell us that she's always quite mindful of the messages that she is endorsing and helping convey.
And to what extent did she consider herself a feminist?
Well, she has in recent years been kind of, put on the spot by interviewers, and she for the most part, has been quite averse to that term. And this is really the crux of why I ever wrote this book, because I grew up in a moderately conservative environment, I would say, in a small rural area in Kansas. This was before the sort of far right movement that today we associate with quote unquote red areas. So it was kind of like a Reagan era sort of. I thought of myself as socially liberal, but anyway, that's just a little context for your listeners to understand that I myself, as a very independent, ambitious teenage girl, was averse to the term feminist. I'm not sure if I would have used that label for myself, even as I absolutely believed in the equality of the sexes. Some political forces had successfully weaponized that term by the time I was a teenager in the 1990s, such that my definition for the word was different than my definition is today as a first-generation college student who's now straddles this class line as a professional in the media industry, but who nonetheless grew up on a struggling wheat farm. So, I think that the way that Dolly Parton comes at this is similar, that, her relationship to the term is fraught, probably because of influences swirling around her life and her place in her home that, have unfortunately given the idea of feminism with a capital F a bad name. Those sorts of tropes go back to, you could go back centuries, but let's say the suffrage movement at the turn of the 20th century. There would be political cartoons of suffragettes being presented as these hag-like, mean, man-killing witches, and the kind of similar imagery popped up again in the 1970s during the women's liberation movement. And that sort of vilification of the woman who is struggling for her own equality and independence, unfortunately, it gets into the DNA of our culture. And so, nonetheless, Dolly Parton has exquisitely embodied and exemplified the tenets of feminism every step of the way in her life. And what I wanted to explore and to challenge people to consider is that while the movement that is associated with college campuses and a class of women who is, has at least the, economic resources and civic agency to attend a march on a work day, while that is an important movement to which my generation owes a great deal, all the same, there are women who they might not be at the march. They might even be suspicious of the word feminism. And yet that doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't really badass feminists in their own lives. And so kind of parsing apart the language and the proud T-shirts that say feminist, and then to examine feminism also as an experiential wisdom. Those two things don't always overlap, and I think Dolly Parton is a good figure for examining that divide.
Sarah Smarsh, the book is She Come By It Natural, Dolly Parton and the Woman Who Lived Her Songs. Sarah, I thank you so much for spending time with us.
Thanks again, Jeff.
Thank you.